The following days felt like a blur to Ethan. Every time he thought he was getting a handle on things, new challenges arose, and the weight of his new role pressed heavier on his shoulders. But despite the chaos, one thing remained constant: Princess Lyra. She was the thread that held everything together, even when it seemed like everything around her was falling apart. They continued to meet with various factions within the Viari Empire, trying to negotiate peace and find common ground. It was a delicate dance, one that required both patience and diplomacy. Lyra worked tirelessly, using every tool at her disposal to keep the peace. But as the days passed, it became clear that the situation was growing more dire. The factions were becoming more entrenched in their positions, and the threat of civil war loomed ever closer. Ethan wasn't sure how much longer they could keep this up. It seemed like every time they made progress, something else would happen to push them back. But through it all, he never saw Lyra give up. She was always calm, always composed, even when things seemed impossible. One evening, as they sat in her private quarters, Lyra let out a heavy sigh and leaned back in her chair. The exhaustion in her eyes was palpable, but she didn't speak about it. Instead, she simply stared out the window at the vast emptiness of space, as though searching for an answer she couldn't find. "Princess," Ethan said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "You've been working non-stop. You need to rest." Lyra turned to him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I don't have time for rest. There's too much at stake." Ethan shook his head. "That's exactly why you need rest. You can't help anyone if you're running on empty." For a moment, Lyra didn't say anything. She just looked at him, her gaze thoughtful. Then, with a small sigh, she stood up and walked over to the window. "I know you're right. But it's hard to step away when everything is falling apart." Ethan joined her at the window, his eyes following hers as they looked out into the vastness of space. "I don't think it's falling apart. I think you're doing the best you can, and that's all anyone can ask for." Lyra glanced at him, her expression softening. "You believe in me, don't you?" Ethan met her gaze and nodded. "I do." A long silence passed between them. The stars outside seemed to shine brighter, as if echoing the quiet, unspoken connection that had formed between them. Ethan wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the way he had come to care for Lyra more than he had ever imagined. She was strong, determined, and despite the heavy burden of her position, she never let it break her. "I'm glad you're here," Lyra said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I never thought I would find someone like you, someone who sees things the way you do." Ethan smiled, though there was a tinge of sadness in his eyes. "I never thought I'd be here either, but I'm glad I am." Lyra turned back to face him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read his thoughts. "I don't know what I would have done without you. You've helped me more than you'll ever know." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. He hadn't done much. He had only tried to help where he could. But in that moment, he realized that it was enough. Helping Lyra, being there for her, was more important than anything else. The next day, things took an unexpected turn. The Viari ship received word that one of the rebel factions had launched an attack on a nearby colony. The news sent shockwaves through the ship. It wasn't just a political move anymore. It was an act of war. Ethan watched as Lyra's calm demeanor shifted, her face tightening with concern. The weight of the Empire's future rested on her shoulders, and for the first time he saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "What are we going to do?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. Lyra didn't answer right away. She stared at the communication panel in front of her, the gravity of the situation settling in. Finally she spoke, her voice firm. "We'll do what we must. We can't let this escalate." Ethan nodded, though he knew it wasn't going to be that simple. A rebellion was never easy to deal with, especially when it came from within your own empire. Lyra's eyes were filled with determination, but Ethan could see the exhaustion in her. She was still trying to balance everything: her duty to the Empire, her role as a leader, and her desire to avoid the bloodshed that a full-scale war would bring. "We'll need to call a meeting with the other factions," Lyra said, her voice unwavering. "We need to present a united front. If we allow this rebellion to spread, we'll lose everything." Ethan watched her for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had no idea how to stop a war, but he knew that Lyra was right. They couldn't let this happen. The Empire, her people, they all depended on her, and if she failed, there was no telling what would happen next. As the meeting with the factions began, Ethan stood quietly in the corner of the room, watching as Lyra took control of the situation. She was calm, measured, speaking with the authority of someone who had been born into this world of politics and power. But even as she spoke, Ethan could see the strain in her eyes. One of the older Viari advisors, a man named Orin, was the first to speak. "Princess, we cannot afford to be weak. Rebellion has already taken control of several key colonies. If we don't act quickly, we risk losing more." Lyra's eyes narrowed, but her voice remained calm. "I'm aware of the situation, Orin, but we cannot just act in haste. We need to understand why they are rebelling. We need to address their grievances, not just silence them." Orin scoffed. "You're still trying to talk to them? This rebellion is a direct threat to the Empire. It cannot be allowed to continue." Ethan watched the exchange with growing concern. It was clear that not everyone was on the same page. Some wanted peace, but others, like Orin, were more interested in brute force. He could see that Lyra was struggling to balance both sides of the argument, but he also knew that if the situation wasn't handled carefully, they would be headed for war. Lyra turned to the room, her voice firm. "I will not allow bloodshed without reason. I will not let our empire destroy itself over a misunderstanding. We will send a delegation to speak with the rebels. If they refuse, then we will act." There was a tense silence in the room as the advisors exchanged looks. Finally, Orin spoke again, his voice cold. "You're risking everything on this. If they do not listen, if they attack again, we will have no choice but to retaliate." "I understand the risks," Lyra replied, her voice steady. "But I will not let my people suffer because of pride or fear. We will find a way to end this without unnecessary bloodshed." The meeting ended shortly after that, and Ethan followed. Lyra back to her quarters. The tension in the air was thick, and he could sense the weight of the decision she had just made. "You did well," Ethan said quietly, as they walked together down the corridor. Lyra didn't answer immediately. She walked slowly, her expression thoughtful. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "I don't know if I did well, Ethan. I just know I have to try. I can't let everything I've worked for fall apart." Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her. "You're doing the right thing. You don't have to do this alone. I'm here for you, no matter what." Lyra met his gaze, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite read. It was a mixture of gratitude, determination, and perhaps even something deeper. For a moment, they stood there, the weight of the moment hanging between them. Without another word, Lyra walked past him, her shoulders squared, ready to face whatever came next. Ethan watched her go, his heart heavy. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He couldn't walk away now, not when she needed him most. He had to stay by her side, no matter the cost. The battle for the Empire had only just begun, but together they would face it. Together, they would find a way through the darkness. The days passed quickly after that conversation with Lyra. Ethan felt like he was living in a whirlwind, caught between his usual life as a mechanic and this new, strange role as a trusted ally to the Viari princess. Every time he tried to find his footing, something else came up. New meetings, new challenges, new responsibilities. It was nothing like the quiet, predictable life he had known before. He spent the next few days on the Viari ship, helping Lyra with anything she needed. He worked closely with her advisors, learning about the inner workings of the Empire, about the factions that were causing unrest. The more he learned, the more he realized just how complicated the situation was. There were so many people involved, each with their own agendas, their own desires. Some wanted power, others wanted peace. Some wanted to expand the Empire's influence, while others wanted to keep things as they were. And then there were the rebels, the ones who had begun to speak out against the Empire, calling for its downfall. They were a growing force, and their numbers were swelling with every passing day. The more Ethan heard about them, the more it seemed like the Empire was on the verge of a civil war, a war that could tear everything apart. Lyra seemed determined. To prevent that from happening, She spent long hours in meetings trying to broker deals, calm tensions, and find common ground between the factions. But every time she took one step forward, it felt like she was being pushed 2 steps back. Her allies in the Empire were growing more distant, and her enemies more vocal. Ethan didn't know much about politics, but he could see that Lyra was struggling. He saw the way her shoulders slumped after each failed negotiation, the way her eyes grew weary with each new conflict. He saw how she tried to stay strong, how she wore a mask of composure, but there were moments when it all seemed to crack, and the weight of the Empire's problems became too much to bear. One evening, as they sat in the ship's observation deck, Ethan couldn't help but notice the way Lyra stared out at the stars. There was a sadness in her eyes, a quiet longing that made his heart ache. He had never seen her like this before, and it made him realize just how much pressure she was under. "Princess," he said softly, his voice cutting through the silence. "You don't have to carry all of this on your own. I know you've got a lot of people working with you, but you're only one person. You can't do everything yourself." Lyra didn't immediately respond. She continued to stare out at the stars, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the viewport. After a long moment, she turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "I know," she said quietly, "but this is my responsibility. I am the heir to the Veyari throne. If I can't save the Empire, then who will?" Ethan shook his head. "That's not fair. You can't be the only one carrying this burden. There are people who want to help you, people who believe in you." Lyra's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "I'm not sure that's true. Not everyone believes in me, or factions within the Empire that see me as weak, as too young and inexperienced to lead. They would rather see someone else on the throne, someone who can be controlled." Ethan frowned. He had heard whispers about the internal power struggles within the Veyari Empire, but hearing Lyra speak about it made it feel all the more real. It was clear that she was caught in a struggle, not just for control of the Empire, but for her own future. And it was a struggle that wasn't going to be easy to win. "You don't have to prove anything to them," Ethan said, his voice firm. "You're stronger than they give you credit for. I've seen it." Lyra's gaze softened slightly, but there was still a sadness in her eyes. "You don't understand. They don't see strength in the way you do. To them, strength is about power, about control. It's about domination. And that's not me." Ethan wasn't sure how to respond to that. He'd never thought of strength in those terms. To him, strength had always been about resilience, about the ability to keep going even when everything seemed impossible. But he realized that Lyra's world was different. The Veyari Empire was built on power, and in their eyes, weakness wasn't. Just a personal flaw was a threat to the entire empire. "I don't know what you can do to change their minds," Ethan said finally. "But I do know this: you don't have to fight this battle alone. I'll help you however I can." Lyra looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find the truth in his words. For a moment, neither of them spoke. And then, at last, she smiled just a little. But it was enough to make Ethan's heart skip a beat. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly. "That means more to me than you know." It wasn't much, but to Ethan, it was enough. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but one thing was clear: he had made a difference, even if it was just in this small moment. And as long as he could help her, as long as he could make a difference in the fight for the Veyari Empire, he would. He wasn't going to give up on her, no matter how difficult things became. The next day, Ethan found himself in yet another tense meeting with Lyra and her advisors. They were discussing the growing unrest in the Empire, the factions that were becoming more vocal with each passing day. Ethan had never been a part of anything like this before, and it was starting to feel like he was in way over his head. But as the meeting wore on, he realized that he was more useful than he had given himself credit for. His perspective, his ability to think outside the box, was exactly what Lyra and her advisors needed. He wasn't afraid to speak up when he thought something was wrong, and he wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo at one point. During a heated discussion about the best course of action, Ethan spoke up. "What if we try something different? Instead of trying to force these factions to agree, why not give them a reason to cooperate? Something they can all agree on?" Lyra's eyes widened in surprise. "What do you mean?" Ethan shrugged. "Well, if we're always trying to push them into a corner, they're just going to resist. But what if we gave them something they all want? What if we find a way to unite them against a common enemy, something they can all rally around? There. It was a long pause as the room fell silent. For a moment, it seemed like no one knew how to respond. But then one of the senior advisors spoke up. "That's an interesting idea," the advisor said slowly. "If we can find a way to make them see the bigger picture, we might be able to get them to put aside their differences. But we'd need to be careful. If we give them too much power, they could turn on us." Ethan nodded. "I'm not saying it's a perfect solution, but it's better than what we've been doing. We've been trying to fight them head on, but we're not getting anywhere." Lyra looked at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I agree. It's worth a try." As the meeting continued, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had made a difference. And while it was only one small step, it was a step in the right direction. For the first time since he had arrived on the VRE ship, he felt like he was actually helping. Like he was a part of something that mattered. And as he looked at Lyra, sitting at the head of the table, her eyes filled with determination, he knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened next, he wasn't going to let her down. Ethan's mind raced as he left the conference room. He had been on the VRE ship for only a few hours, yet it already felt like he had been swept into something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. One minute he was just fixing engines, and now he was being asked to help solve a galactic crisis. The weight of it all pressed down on him, and as much as he tried to shake off the feeling of being out of his depth, the thought lingered in the back of his mind. He was still thinking about it. When he found himself standing in the ship's observation deck, staring out at the stars, the view was breathtaking. From here, the vast emptiness of space stretched out, endless and beautiful. Ethan had always loved looking at the stars. Back on Earth, he had spent many nights sitting on the roof of his house, just watching the sky. But this was different. This was a different view altogether. And now, he was part of something much larger than himself. Princess Lyra had been kind, patient, and understanding. But he could tell there was more to her request than she had let on. The VRE Empire was in trouble. She needed someone like him, a human who wasn't weighed down by their politics, someone who could think outside the box. The question was, what could a mechanic like him possibly offer that the vast resources of the VRE Empire couldn't, Ethan? Lyra's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see her standing in the doorway of the observation room. She had a gentle smile on her face, but there was something in her eyes that made him think she had more to say. "May I join you, of course?" he said, stepping aside to let her in. As she entered, he noticed the subtle change in her expression. The confident, composed princess he had seen earlier seemed to be replaced by someone more thoughtful, more uncertain. Lyra walked up to the large viewport and stood next to him, her gaze fixed on the stars. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the quiet of the space around them mirrored the silence that had settled between them. "You seem deep in thought," Lyra finally said, breaking the stillness. "Are you regretting your decision to help us?" Ethan shook his head quickly. "No, I'm just trying to figure out what I can actually do. I'm a mechanic, not a diplomat or a general. I don't know anything about galactic politics." Lyra glanced at him, her amber eyes searching his face as though looking for something. "But that is exactly why you are here, to see things differently from us. You're not bound by tradition or the weight of centuries of history. You are free to act on instinct, to think without worrying about the consequences." Ethan frowned. "But doesn't that make me dangerous? You said yourself that the VRE Empire is dealing with a lot of internal conflict. The last thing anyone needs is someone like me stumbling around and making things worse." Lyra sighed and looked back out at the stars. "You think you are the only one who feels out of place? My people have been at the top of the galaxy for so long, we have forgotten what it's like to struggle, to be vulnerable. We have grown complacent, and that is why we are in danger. We need someone who can remind us of what it means to be humans, someone who doesn't take everything for granted." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. He had always thought of himself as just a regular guy, a mechanic who fixed things for a living. But now, for the first time in his life, he was being told he had something special to offer. The idea seemed impossible, but Lyra's words made him wonder if there was more to him than he had ever realized. "Tell me more about this threat." Ethan said after a long pause, breaking the silence between them. What exactly is happening? Lyra turned to face him. Her expression was serious now, her lips pressed together in a tight line. There are many factions within the Veyari Empire, political parties, military groups, and noble houses. Some of them are content with the way things are, but others want change. They believe the Empire is too focused on expansion, too focused on control. They want to shift the balance of power, to take more aggressive action. Ethan nodded slowly, trying to absorb the information. So you have groups within your own empire that want to overthrow the current system. Lyra's eyes narrowed. It's more complicated than that. Not all of them want to overthrow the throne. Some want to weaken it. Others want to gain more influence. It's a game of power, and it's tearing the empire apart. Sounds like a mess, Ethan said, his tone dry. He wasn't sure how much he could contribute to a situation like this, but he felt a strange sense of responsibility. Lyra had asked for his help. That had to mean something, right? It is, Lyra agreed. And it is not something that can be solved with force alone. We need to find a way to unite the different factions, to convince them that we are stronger together than apart. And that is where you come in. Ethan looked at her in confusion. How can I help with that? I don't know anything about politics or diplomacy. I'm just a mechanic. You are not just a mechanic, Lyra said firmly. You are someone who can see things from a different perspective. You can approach problems in ways that we cannot. You can bridge the gap between us and others. Ethan couldn't help but chuckle. You really have a lot of faith in me, don't you? Lyra smiled, a small but genuine expression that warmed Ethan's heart. I believe in you, Ethan Donovan. I believe in your ability to help us see things clearly, to guide us through the darkness. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan had never thought of himself as anyone special. He had always just been a guy who fixed things, someone who got his hands dirty and stayed out of the spotlight. But here he was, standing next to a princess, being told that he could help save an entire empire. I'll do my best, Ethan said quietly, his voice full of determination. I know you will, Lyra said, her voice soft but full of trust, and you are not alone in this. We will work together to make the right choices. But for now, I need to know that you are ready to face the challenges ahead. Ethan looked at her, his mind racing. Could he really do this? Could he really help solve a problem as big as this? He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. He had been given an opportunity to make a difference, and he wasn't going to back down from it. I'm ready, he said finally, his voice steady. Lyra gave him a small nod of approval. Good, we will begin tomorrow. There is much to discuss, and time is running out. As they stood together in the observation deck, the stars outside seemed to glow a little brighter. Ethan didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was part of something bigger, something that could change the course of history. And that thought was both terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. The small human outpost on the edge of the galaxy was quiet, almost forgotten. It was meant to be a place for minor repairs and routine checks, far from the bustling centers of galactic trade and politics. Ethan sat at his workbench, the hum of his tools mixing with the faint vibrations of the station's engine. The day had started like any other, with a simple task of recalibrating some equipment. His hands moved quickly, each motion practiced from years of training. He had always found a certain peace in this work. Simple, mechanical, it's predictable. Then the alarm blared. Ethan didn't panic, though. He had learned long ago to ignore most of the station's alerts. It could have been anything small. Glitch, a routine check-in, or a malfunction somewhere in the system. He reached for the come button to dismiss the alarm. But then another sound cut through the noise, a sharp voice from the intercom. Ethan Donovan, report to docking bay. 3 immediately. There's a priority situation. The message wasn't a typical station announcement. The voice was tight, urgent. Ethan frowned and stood, wiping his grease-streaked hands on his jumpsuit as he made his way to the docking bay. When he arrived, he was greeted by a scene far more dramatic than he had expected. Standing at the center of the bay was a massive alien starship, sleek, dark, and glowing faintly with an otherworldly energy. It was clearly a royal vessel, its design completely different from anything humans had ever built. The station crew was already bustling around, preparing for something, but no one seemed to know exactly what was happening. Ethan, the voice of his supervisor, Sam, called out, "We've got a situation. The VRE Royal ship is in distress. They need a mechanic, and you're the closest qualified human." Ethan blinked, trying to absorb the news. The VRE were one of the most powerful empires in the galaxy, a race of beings who were known for their advanced technology and rigid social structure. The fact that they would come to a small, remote human outpost for help spoke volumes about their desperation. He nodded quickly. "All right, I'll get to work." As Ethan walked toward the ship, a crew member from the VRE vessel approached him. She was tall, with a grace that seemed almost unnatural, and her skin shimmered with a faint purple hue. Her eyes glowed a soft amber, reflecting intelligence and caution. "You are Ethan Donovan, yes?" she asked, her voice clear and controlled. "That's me," he replied, trying to keep his tone casual despite the nervous fluttering in his chest. "What seems to be the problem?" "We have an issue with our propulsion system," she said, leading him up the ramp into the ship. "It's not critical yet, but if we don't fix it soon, we could be stranded." Ethan nodded and followed her inside. The interior of the ship was luxurious, the walls lined with polished metal and strange symbols. Everything seemed to be perfectly designed, from the lighting to the temperature to the furnishings. It was a far cry from the utilitarian stations and ships humans were used to. As they walked through the halls, Ethan couldn't help but notice the stares of the VRE crews, some of them curious, others skeptical. It was clear they weren't used to humans being anywhere near their ship, let alone working on it. They stopped in front of a large, open bay where the propulsion system was exposed. Ethan immediately got to work, inspecting the components. He muttered to himself as he checked each part, trying to figure out what was causing the malfunction. As he worked, the VRE woman watched him closely, her amber eyes never leaving. "Him. So what's your name?" Ethan asked, trying to break the silence. It wasn't easy. He wasn't used to speaking with alien royalty, and he wasn't sure how to act around someone like her. "I am Princess Lyra VRE," she said, her tone cold but not unkind. "I am the daughter of the Empress." Ethan looked up from his work, momentarily stunned. Princess. He hadn't expected this. He'd assumed she was a crew member or an officer, not royalty. He quickly turned back to the propulsion system, trying to hide his surprise. "Princess, huh?" he muttered under his breath. "I guess I should have dressed nicer." Lyra didn't respond, but there was a faint glimmer of something in her eyes, a spark of curiosity, or perhaps amusement. She watched him work for a few moments, then spoke. "Again, I've heard much about humans," she said. "Your species is ... interesting." Ethan smiled without looking up. "We try. Sometimes we screw things up, though." The princess tilted her head. "I do not believe that. I've read about your history. You have overcome many obstacles, even when the odds were against you." Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at her words. He paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch between them. There was something calming about her presence, something that made him feel at ease despite the overwhelming strangeness of the situation. "I guess that's true," he said. "We've got a knack for surviving." Lyra's gaze softened, and for a moment Ethan thought he saw something in her eyes, something that went beyond the formality of their conversation. He quickly returned to the task at hand, trying to shake the feeling off. He had a job to do, and he couldn't afford to get distracted. After a few more minutes of work, Ethan finally found the issue: a minor power surge in the system that had caused the propulsion to malfunction. It was a simple fix, and he quickly patched it up. The ship hummed back to life, the systems clicking back into place. "There," Ethan said, wiping his hands on a rag. "You're good to go." Lyra seemed to study him for a moment before speaking again. "You are ... impressive," Ethan chuckled nervously. "Just doing my job." The princess stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "You're a skilled mechanic. And you did not seem overwhelmed by the situation." "Not my first time working under pressure," Ethan replied with a shrug. "But hey, glad I could help." Hey? There was a long pause as Lyra looked at him. Ethan shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, unsure of what she was thinking. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then hesitated, as though reconsidering her words. "You. Humans are different," she said at last. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Different good or different bad? Lyra's lips curled into a slight smile, and Ethan couldn't help but notice how her eyes softened, just a little. Different, intriguing. The moment stretched on for a few more seconds, an unspoken connection forming between them. Ethan wasn't sure what to make of it, but he couldn't deny that there was something about Lyra that intrigued him. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, or the quiet intelligence that radiated from her. Or maybe it was just the strange feeling that she wasn't like the other aliens he had met. She wasn't just distant and aloof. She was human in some ways. Before he could say anything else, a voice interrupted them. "Princess Lyra, we're ready to depart." A Viari officer called from the doorway. "The ship is fully repaired." Lyra nodded, then turned to Ethan. "Thank you again, Ethan Donovan. You have my gratitude." "No," quick nod, "no problem. Glad I could help." As he left the ship, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something far bigger than he had imagined. He wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the princess's words, or the way she had looked at him, but something told him this was far from the last time he would see her. Ethan woke up to the sound of the alarm blaring through the station. It wasn't his usual wake-up call. This one was sharp and insistent, a sign that something important had happened. With a groan, he rubbed his eyes and sat up. The events of the day before slowly coming back to him. He had worked on a Viari royal ship. Not just any ship, but one belonging to Princess Lyra herself. The thought made him smile, even if it was a bit ridiculous. He had always seen himself as a simple mechanic, the kind of guy who fixed broken engines and didn't get involved in politics or royal matters. But now, he was part of a story that involved one of the most powerful empires in the galaxy. He quickly dressed and made his way to the repair bay, familiar hum of the station's engines greeting him as he passed through the narrow corridors. The crew was already busy with their usual tasks, but something felt different today. There was a tension in the air, an undercurrent of excitement that made Ethan wonder if he had missed something important. As he entered the bay, he saw Sam, his supervisor, standing near the entrance. Sam looked like he had seen a ghost. His eyes were wide, and he was muttering something under his breath. "Ethan, thank goodness you're here," Sam said, almost breathless. "The Vayar ship, it's back, and they want you." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean they want me?" "I mean the princess. She's asking for you specifically." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Princess Lyra asking for him? He'd only fixed a minor malfunction on her ship the day before. He hadn't expected to see her again, at least not like this. "Is this some kind of joke?" Ethan asked, trying to sound casual, even though his mind was racing. Sam shook his head. "I don't think so. You need to get over there fast. They've requested your presence immediately." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his toolkit and rushed toward the docking bay where the Viari ship awaited. His heart pounded in his chest. What did Princess Lyra want with him? He couldn't deny that he was curious, but at the same time, he felt a strange knot in his stomach. As he approached the royal ship, he noticed the crew was acting differently this time. The officers and soldiers were more tense, their eyes scanning the area as if they were expecting trouble. Ethan couldn't understand why they were so on edge. The ship was fine now, after all. He had fixed it. But then he saw her. Princess Lyra stood at the top of the ship's ramp, her expression unreadable. She was surrounded by her guards, but there was something different about the way she carried herself today. Her usual calm demeanor had shifted, replaced by a sense of urgency. "Ethan Donovan," she said as he reached the top of the ramp, her voice smooth, yet commanding. "I am glad you could join me." Ethan stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. "Princess," he said, giving her a respectful nod. "What's going on? Why did you want to see me?" Lyra looked at him for a moment, her amber eyes studying him carefully. "I wanted to thank you properly. You saved our ship, and we owe you more than just words." Ethan blinked in surprise. "You don't need to thank me. It was just a simple fix I didn't please," Lyra interrupted gently, her voice softening. "Allow me to finish. You did something more than just fix our ship. He gave us something we don't often experience. Ethan wasn't sure he understood what she meant. Trust? Yes, Lyra said, her eyes never leaving his. In my culture, trust is something that is earned through years of diplomacy and service. But you, a human, earned it in the span of a few hours. You didn't just fix the propulsion system. You spoke to us with honesty and respect. You did not fear us. That is rare. Ethan wasn't sure how to respond to that. He'd never really thought about how his behavior might be seen by others, especially by someone from an empire as vast and powerful as the Veyari. He had simply done his job and tried to treat everyone like a person, not a title. But hearing Lyra say it like that made him realize just how much that simple act had meant. I didn't know I was doing anything special, he said, his voice quiet. I just did what I was trained to do, Lyra smiled, and for a brief moment, Ethan saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something warm and genuine. It made his heart skip in his chest. I know, she said softly. But to us, that was more than just a repair. It was a reminder that not all beings are driven by politics and power. Some are willing to do what is right without expecting anything in return. Ethan didn't know how to reply to that. He was still trying to wrap his head around the idea that someone like Lyra, a princess of the Veyari Empire, would be looking at him this way. He was just a mechanic, nothing special. And yet here she was, thanking him for something he hadn't even thought twice about. Is there anything else I can do for you? Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm happy to help, but I'm not sure what I can. Lyra raised her hand, silencing him. There is one more thing, she said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. I need you to come with me. There is something I must discuss with you, something that concerns both our people. Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion. Is it? What do you need me for? Lyra's gaze softened, but her words were no less firm. You are no ordinary human. I see that now. You have something that few others possess: an open mind and the courage to face the unknown. That is why I need you. Ethan couldn't understand what she meant, but he wasn't about to turn down a royal invitation. All right, he said, slowly, trying to keep his voice calm despite the sudden surge of nervousness. I'll come with you. They walked together, heading deeper into the ship. As they moved through the corridors, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something big was happening. The Veyari were not the kind of people who invited outsiders into their inner circles, especially not humans. The fact that Lyra had asked for him specifically only added to the mystery. As they entered a large conference room, Ethan took a seat across from the princess. The room was grand, with strange alien symbols on the walls, and a large table in the center. It was the kind of room where decisions were made, where the future of entire species was determined. For the first time, Ethan felt like he was a part of that. Lyra sat across from him, her expression serious now. Ethan, what? I'm about to tell you is not something I share lightly, she began. The Veyari Empire is at a crossroads. We have been expanding for centuries, but there are threats on the horizon. A coalition of alien races has begun to challenge our power, and there is talk of war. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. War? He echoed. But you're one of the most powerful empires in the galaxy. How can I know? Lyra interrupted. But even the strongest can falter. There are many factions within the empire, and not all of them agree on the best course of action. I fear that internal strife may be just as dangerous as any external threat. Ethan leaned forward, his mind racing. So what does this have to do with me? Lyra looked at him intently.
Oh.
I need someone who can help bridge the gap between the Veyari and other species. Someone who isn't bound by tradition. Someone who can think outside the box. I believe you are that person, Ethan Donovan. Ethan's mind was spinning. He had no idea how he, a simple mechanic, could possibly help in a situation like this. But he couldn't ignore the seriousness in Lyra's voice. There was a weight to her words that made it clear she wasn't asking for help out of curiosity or politeness. She was asking because she believed he could make a difference. I don't know how I can help, he said slowly. I'm just a mechanic, not a diplomat or a leader. Lyra smiled slightly. You may not realize it, but you have already proven your worth. Your honesty, your willingness to speak your mind, those are traits that will serve you well, not just here, but in the challenges ahead. Ethan didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure if he was ready for something so big, but something. In Lyra's eyes, something in the way she looked at him made him think that maybe, just maybe, he had been brought into this for a reason. "I'll help," Ethan said finally. "But I'll need to understand more." "What exactly do you want me to do?" Lyra's smile widened. "For now, just be yourself. That is more than enough."